Oh, now you can hear me.
Yes, now it's okay. So sorry for a bit delay. You know how it's. So you're ready? Welcome to UTIC.
No problem.
Yes,
I'm ready.
We all remember about your first UTIC in Ukraine. So thanks for coming that time, and thanks for your online presentation today. I hope it will be interesting as usual. So please start. And a couple of words about yourself, please.
Okay, thank you. Let me first share my screen here. And can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me again. I'm not sure whether some of you remember that I was in Kiev, I think 3 years ago, and I had a really wonderful time. Even though I remember I went out to a steakhouse with some of you and I cut myself terribly on my hand, which was really, I felt really stupid about that. But I had a nice time being with you, so thank you for having me again here at this really rustic location that you are gathering this time.
Welcome.
Those of you who know me know that I'm particularly interested in translation technology. And that's, of course, what I want to talk to you about today. But rather than talking about many specific technologies, I would prefer to talk about technology in general and in the way that the public perceives it, and in the way we need to respond to that, and in the way that we do or don't involve ourselves into the development of translation technology. So that's really the focus of our talk today. Just a couple of words about myself. I'm a translator. I'm an English to German translator. But I also, and that's the reason why I'm speaking at conferences and publishing a lot of material. I'm also really interested in translation technology and trying to. I'm trying to be a cheerleader for translators and translation professionals to use technology, but to use it wisely and not to jump into using technology without any good reason. So let's start with our presentation here. You can see my Twitter handle is Jeromobot if you want to tweet, and you all know that the hashtag is UTICamp for our conference here. So this is a really typical kind of article we see so much. I'm not sure how often you see those in Ukraine or in Russia, but I assume you see those quite regularly as well. We here in the US and in Europe see them all the time, and those are articles about translation technology, and they inevitably call up some of those images like you see here of Uhura from Star Trek, who is listening to her universal translator. And in this case, you see that image of Star Trek, and the first paragraph right below then quotes the other one that we always see quoted by the public media or the general public when they talk about translation technology is, of course, the Babelfish from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So this is what the general public is interested in connection with translation technology, or at least what journalists want the general public to be interested in. It's a dream that has been foreshadowed, they say, in the great science fiction shows of the 70s or 60s and 70s and 80s, and now finally finds fruition in translation technology, that now we are either almost or already at the point of having that universal translation available for everyone. Now, you and I know that that's nonsense. You and I know as translation professionals that we're far from that point. That yes, there has been progress in the development of some translation technologies, but we are far from what Uhura is doing here. So what is it on what do we need to do to respond to those kinds of presentations of translation technology? Here's another example, which I think is very revealing. This is something that was published 2 years ago, and the screenshot here is of Google News. Google News, for those who don't know, is a service that aggregates news articles and makes it easy to look for a certain keyword and find articles that relate to that certain keyword. And I usually once a day look at Google News to find articles that have been published in regard to translation. Now, you all remember when Microsoft first unveiled the Skype instant interpreter, that integrated interpretation within Skype. And when they first unveiled it at a big conference, it was actually a real bust. It was not successful the way they showed it, I think, but it was still a huge thing for the media. And you can see that down at the bottom, I circled how many articles that day were published about that presentation. It was 300 some articles. That day happened to be the day, and of course not without coincidence, because Microsoft had chosen the presentation for that day. That day also happened to be International Translation Day, so it was September 30th. You can see that on the same day, 8 articles have been written about International Translation Day versus 300 some articles about a technology that Microsoft just published that didn't actually work quite right. So that's an amazing contradiction, right? So on one hand, International Translation Day is something that could really be useful for us to promote it, and on the other hand, we completely fail doing it, and essentially leave the technology people free reign to do whatever they want. So how can we respond to that? What needs to be our response as a community of translation professionals to that? Well, I think first of all, we actually need to welcome it. We need to say, great that you're interested in translation. You know what? I'm interested in translation too. And let me tell you a little bit about what I know of translation. So rather than just deriding it and saying, well, this is not something that is positive at all. We need to be frustrated about these articles in the media. We need to welcome them, I think, but then we need to steer them into the right direction. And what do we do to steer, to control them into something that is helpful for us? I think first of all, and this sounds a little basic maybe, but I think it's really important, we need to actually understand what we're talking about. Some of you know that I've been talking to translation professionals for almost 20 years now in seminars and in workshops and in talks like this. And I've been continuously astounded by the very low level of education about the stuff that we are using ourselves. So I've been astonished sometimes to find out that we actually don't truly understand what kind of technology we are using ourselves. So we need to understand what translation technology is. And translation technology is, of course, not only machine translation. Machine translation plays a part in translation technology, and a really important part, but it's not the only part of translation technology. As you and I, of course, know, because the technologies that you and I are using day in and day out might include machine translation, but more than likely they either don't or don't to a great extent. So we need to really understand that to be able to intelligently communicate that. We do need to understand machine translation as well also. Now, machine translation is not particularly easy to understand. You have to have some real you have to really sit down and study it to understand it. Now, mind you, I'm not saying to develop it or to make it to become part of the development of machine translation. That's not what I necessarily mean, but you need to understand the principles of machine translation. Every one of us, every one of you needs to understand how machine translation works. And and of course there are a number of different ways of machine translation. There's the rule-based machine translation of the early days. Then there is the statistical machine translation of the second wave of machine translation, and now we're all talking about neural machine translation, and those need to be terms that you need to be able to fill with content. You need to be able to understand a decent amount of details. And the second thing you need to do then is to simplify those details so you can actually explain it to outsiders who will not have the same kind of background than you. So I think that's something that every one of us individually and maybe as a group need to do. We need to study the technology, we need to comprehend it, and then we need to enable ourselves to be good about explaining it to people who don't know what's that all about. The journalists who write about, we are on the brink of complete translatability of everything. They don't understand what they're talking about, so we need to help them in that. And then we need to also be able to talk positively about machine translation. Of course, the easiest thing for all of us to say is to say, well, Google Translate has a real reason to be for gisting translation, and that's true, clearly. I mean, if billions of people every day access Google Translate or Microsoft Translator or Yandex or whatever machine translation they use online, then there is a good reason for that, and there is a good use for that. But there's also really interesting stories about machine translation and its use. And I want to share one with you that I actually shared with you 3 years ago, or 2 or 4, I forget when it was, when I was in Kiev. And it's a story I really love. And it's a story about machine translation and one of the positive ways of using machine translation. And it goes like this. In 1997, the bird flu broke out in Hong Kong. And the bird flu, as you know, is obviously carried by birds, and the government in Hong Kong was very well organized. Is still well organized today. Was well organized back then also. So there was a real strong response to that. And essentially, all birds were killed in Hong Kong. Every single bird was killed. I mean, every single, poultry, chickens, ducks, whatever, were killed in Hong Kong, and that essentially didn't stop the bird flu, but at least slowed the progression down immensely. Two Canadian scientists were in Hong Kong during that time, and they saw that, and they looked at each other, and they went like, so what happens if this doesn't happen in Hong Kong, but happens in the hinterlands of China, or in the woods of Ukraine, or in the Amazon forest in Brazil, or wherever the central government is not able to get to so quickly, and where the central government of that particular country might not even know what's happening. So what they did is they founded an organization called GFIN. And GFIN works closely up to the present day with the World Health Organization. And what they do is they translate about 4,000 articles that were published in not the big national publications, but are published on Facebook, are published in very small local publications, and take those in 8 different languages or 7 different languages, from which they translate into and out of the other languages. So, and they do that to find reports about early outbreaks of some kind of a disease, of nuclear problems, of any kinds of things that where there needs to be an immediate response by the international community, and the response can only happen, obviously, if there is knowledge, about that particular outbreak. And what they do is they then translate it, and then the articles that they find that seem to report something problematic, they pass on to a human translator to verify it. Excuse me. Amazingly enough, both in the case of SARS, the flu outbreak in China, and the swine flu in Mexico in 2003 and 2009, they detected it earlier than anyone else and possibly saved thousands of lives. And by the way, maybe saved your life, or the life of your family, or the life of your friends. So that's a really powerful story about translation, also about machine translation. But the beautiful thing about it is that machine translation doesn't quite work that way. So here's an actual example of the of of something that the team encountered once. The Tampa Tribune, so a newspaper in Florida here in America, had this article. It said, the article was called Yellow Fever, and it said, an epidemic of penalties has thwarted many drives, resulting in a 3-game losing streak and essentially leaving the Bucs season on life support. Now, if the computer sees that, he sees yellow fever, he sees epidemic, and he sees life support, and thinks something terrible is happening in Tampa, Florida. When the human sees it, especially a human who knows that the Bucs actually are a football team in America, they go like, well, this is a story about a football team with just a few too many big words. So the story is so interesting, I think, because computers play a really important role, but humans still will still continue to play the more important role, because they are the ones actually who are able to truly evaluate the content of these articles. So, but let's go back to our topic here on hand. And then, after we can talk positively about MT, about machine translation, we then obviously need to talk about some of the problems that MT creates, and I think we all know many of those problems, so I don't have to give you many examples on about that. So once we do that, once we have assembled that kind of knowledge and that expertise to be able to communicate that, then we need to find avenues to make our opinions known. Then we need to find ways to actually talk about it. And how do we do it? Well, a really easy way is that we respond online to articles such as the one that I just showed you. And, articles like that, at least here in the US, appear like on a daily basis almost. So it could be a full-time job just to respond online to those articles and, in the comment section. But the trick is, I think, to make it smart and to make it not aggressive and not insulting, but really engage into a conversation. There was a really great example yesterday, or day before yesterday, I think, where Dear Abby is an advice column here in America, really famous. Everybody knows Dear Abby. It's really stupid, I think, but still everybody knows it. So it's one of those advice columns where somebody writes in saying, my husband is always mean to me, should I get a divorce or not? And then Dear Abby responds to that. And it's an advice column in all the different, that virtually every newspaper carries. And just the day before yesterday, there was a response by Dear Abby had at some point responded to somebody where she got the terms for translation and interpretation confused, like the general public typically does, and so that what the person was able to do in a response to Abby was to explain what translation and interpretation, how it differentiates itself, what the difference is, and so on and so forth. And he wrote it so intelligently and so compellingly that, of course, that was published then. So that's a really great way of responding to stuff you find in the media that was published about translation. Another way is, of course, social media. You can take stuff that you find published in any kind of publication and respond to it in social media and bring the author into the conversation. Here's a really good example. A while back, I was reading this article in Forbes magazine. So Forbes magazine is a really powerful and important publication. And this particular journalist had written something about translation, where she had used Google Translate to translate part of the article and then commented on it, which I find appalling. It's ridiculous to have somebody as a magazine as as situated like Forbes magazine to use Google Translate to form the basis of an article. So I engaged with her in a conversation, and you don't have to read the whole conversation here on Twitter, but it ended up by her saying, I understand. And I guarantee you that she will never, ever use Google Translate for any of her articles. So I think this is one of those examples where we can not just, make fun of journalists or say, that stupid journalist has once again written something really uneducated about translation, but instead bring them into a conversation and bring them around to us and make them understand what our point is. And I think that's really productive. And lastly, you can also, and you should, and we should, write articles for publications in magazines and in any kind of publication of other industries. So, of course, we can write articles for translation journals, etc., but those don't reach the general public. The general public reads stuff that they are interested in, whatever that might be. So that's where we need to publish our stuff also about what we are doing. And what I've just learned recently is that, and I wouldn't have said that just 6 months ago, but what I've just learned recently is that it's really helpful to have professional help doing this on various levels. And the professional help, starts at writing the article so it can be easily placed into magazines and into journals, etc., and helps you to place the articles in those journals. Caitlin Walsh, the former president of the ATIA, and I just wrote an article about machine translation, and we had a professional agency help us write the articles so that they knew it would be accepted by magazines, and then they helped us to place that article. And you can see here that article was actually then published in 6 different magazines so far, and it's still being offered to other publications still. So in 3 months from now, it might be 12 magazines it was published in. So that's a really good way, I think. And the article is nothing really special, but it explains in very simple language what machine translation is and what benefits machine translation has and what drawbacks machine translation has. And the people who are reading the Nashville magazine here, or the Advisor or the Article Weekly, will have learned more about machine translation than they've ever known before after reading those articles. But let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about the other part of my presentation here. Let's have a quick look at the state of translation technology. So far, we've been talking about what we need to do to engage the public and to change the public's perception of what we do and what translation and translation technology is all about. But let's look at ourselves for a second. Let's look at where we actually stand with translation technology. And I think when we do that, we find out that we are at a really interesting point. Right now, I think it would be not over-exaggerated to say that desktop tools are on the decline and cloud-based tools are on the rise. So Trados and MemoQ are still the 2 biggest tools on the market as far as translation tools go, but both development teams of those tools are very aware that their tools are that their tools need to change to have more of a cloud offering, and the many new tools that are completely cloud-based have really tremendous growth rates. At the same time, while that is happening, most of the cloud-based tools, maybe with the exception of MemSource, are not particularly profitable yet. So we know that the cloud-based tools are coming. We know that they, at some point, are going to overtake the desktop tools, but it hasn't happened yet. So we're just in the process of that taking place, I think. The only and as far as machine translation systems, cloud-based or not, there is nothing that is profitable except Google Translate and Microsoft Translator. They make a lot of money of their offering through advertisement and et cetera, et cetera. But as far as the offerings of companies for professional machine translation, I'm not aware of any company that makes really good money right now with machine translation. So even though we talk so much about machine translation, nobody's making money of it. Also, machine translation use, if you look at the numbers of both Common Sense Advisory or MemSource has been publishing some interesting numbers in the last couple of weeks. Machine translation use from the view of the language service provider, so from the view of the translation agency, is actually in decline, which is a real shock, right? We all think that machine translation is, on the rise, and we are all using machine translation more and more. Well, I think that is true, but not from the view of the point of the language service provider. So what is happening less today than 2 years ago is the typical process by which a project gets pre-translated with machine translation, and the translator then has to post-edit it. That's something that's happening less than it happened just a little while ago. From the translator's perspective, though, I think the use of machine translation is actually rising, because the translators are using machine translation in more intelligent ways and in more proficient ways than using it as a post-editing tool, such as ways to deeply integrate it into their work with translation memories, etc., through auto suggestions, through and a number of other things that machine translation can be integrated into the translation process. So what that all means is that MT will be used somehow, but we really only know the very first steps how machine translation will be used productively. I would advise you, by the way, to go to lilt.com if you haven't done that yet. Lilt.com. I'm not sure whether lilt.com will be the tool that's going to make all the difference, but I think it will be one of the tools that has already shown us how we can expect machine translation will play a role in the future. So we are still figuring out how to use machine translation productively, and I actually can't see my own screen here. Just a second. And interestingly, what all this means also, and this is a whole topic on its own, so we don't have to go into detail here. We can't go into detail here, but since translators are the ones who are actually getting more benefit from machine translation than the language service providers and the agencies at this point, what we will see is that that machine translation will lead to a change in how we're going to charge for translation. That means that the charge by the word or line or page or character that we are doing right now is not sustainable anymore in a model where only one party of the production chain, just the translator, benefits from machine translation. So I think what will happen in the near future is that we are going to charge by the hour for our translation work or by project, and that's, I think, a really positive development. So, is this a good time to participate in development projects? I think it really is. And here are some ideas of what kind of development is possible for you, and even you who might not be very technical. So one thing I think that is a really easy to do way of involving yourself in the development of translation technology is by developing tools that connect to existing application programming interfaces of tools like SDL Trados, MemoQ, or MemSource, or whatever you want to connect to, and build these tools in a way that enhance the productivity and the usability of these tools tremendously. I think that SDL has done us a real favor by opening up what they used to call Open Exchange, now they call it the App Store, where it's easy to create apps that enhance the productivity and the value of SDL products. And most other tools, while not as aggressively marketing it, most other tools have some kind of an API also, which you can use then to build these connectors. And of course, that doesn't just count for, that's not only true for translation tools, but it's also true for things like content management systems, right? Most content sits in content management systems today, and most of these content management systems have APIs that you can use to connect whatever workflow, whatever process you have to those content management systems. And I think that will be a really good way of doing it. I thought before I wrote this presentation here, I tried to think about an example of what a good and successful development was in the last few years and what was not successful. And I came up with this example here. The example of multi-QA versus Xbench. Many of you might never have heard of multi-QA, even though it's a Russian product. But virtually all of you will have heard of Xbench, which is a Spanish product. Multi-QA was a very, very sophisticated quality assurance and terminology verification tool written by a translation agency in Moscow. And when I first looked at it, I had a long conference call with them and I wrote about it. I was very euphoric about it. I was euphoric about it because they had features that no other tool had. They had morphology, rich morphology for many, many languages, and they were able to do things that no other tool did, and yet they completely failed. And they failed to a point where they just recently sold their technology to someone else, and it's going to be used for a completely different purpose now. Xbench did something similar. They have a tool that does something slightly different, but overall very similar. And they are very successful right now. I mean, I'm not sure very successful is right to say, but they are successful now. And so the differences between those two different tools are three things, I think. There was pricing. Xbench was able to offer its tool for a long period of time with no charge. I think for about 4 or 5 years, they never charged for their tool. And only then they started to charge when they saw that they had enough users that they felt confident would stay with the tool, even though there is a charge, and a fairly hefty charge actually now, relatively speaking, and they have done this transition very successfully. So they were able to offer it for free for 4 or 5 years, and then switch to a paid model, and that switch has been successful. Multi-QA started to charge right away, and were not, and that didn't work. Another thing was that what Xbench has done so well is they are integrated into virtually any environment right now, whether it's MemSource, whether it's MemoQ, whether it's Trados, whether it's there's 6 or 7 tools that it directly integrates into, and so that was a really smart way for them to become more well-known and to promote the use of that tool. And lastly, and that's a really important issue also, is that of security. Now, for Xbench, security was never an issue, but for multi-QA, which was partly cloud-based, it was an issue because their cloud was based in Russia. And for Western users right now, it's just really not a preferred way of working with a tool which cloud is based in Russia. So if you do have some kind of a cloud-based offering, you don't want to have the cloud solely based in Russia, I think. Another possibility to involve yourself into any kind of development work is to participate in open source community projects, and I want to mention one project in particular there, and that is a project that is happening in mostly in Germany by now, I think, and it's a project where machine translation is brought together with a quality assurance tool and a translation management system. And what the effort, the goal of this effort is to say that while companies like Lionbridge or WeLocalize or TransPerfect have lots of funds to create their own environments and their own tools, smaller agencies don't. So why don't smaller agencies come together and pool their resources and build up a large system that would essentially do similar things than the likes of Lionbridge and WeLocalize. And that's exactly what they're doing. You see here the supporters of that system include smaller to medium-sized translation agencies that are investing into this environment, and which hopefully will be successfully developed at some point. So that's a good idea also to invest into the development of translation technology. All right, so those are essentially the remarks that I wanted to make, and what I would love is I think have a few minutes left, 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so to talk. What I would love to hear is some of your responses. I know I spoke very quickly and maybe a little bit too fast, and I apologize if I spoke too fast to be really understandable, but I hope that I got myself understood anyway, and let's talk. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Jost. And do we have any comments or questions or remarks? Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Jost. I was about to ask.
You're welcome.
It's Valentina here. I was writing emails to you. Okay, my question is, what about data security in cloud-based CAT tools? Okay, we were talking about servers in Russia, not good. Okay, how do we resolve the security issue with client data, with confidential data when it is stored somewhere in the cloud? How do we guarantee it is safe?
Well, we can only guarantee as much as our vendors tell us it is safe, right? So, for instance, I think a good example is Google Translate, right? Google Translate, when you use the free version of Google Translate, the data is not safe, and Google says it's not safe, right? Google says the data that you upload will be used. However, if you use the API that Google offers, and you would use the API if you use it through Trados or through any other translation tool, in that case, Google tells you that we are not going to use that data. Now, are they really not going to use the data? I don't know. And you know what? I don't care, because they tell me they don't. I have a contract with Google that they don't, so I can show that contract to my client and say, I have a contract with my provider, which in this case is Google, that the data is safe, and that's what I can assure you is going to happen based on that contract. And the same is true if you have other cloud-based tools like Abby, like MemSource, like XDM, like WordBee, and so on. There's a number of them. If they assure you in writing in a contract that the data is safe, it will be safe. I mean, that's just what if they are not clear about concept of data security, and they don't make explicit that they guarantee that your data will only be used by you and by your clients, then you shouldn't work with them. But I can tell you that any tool of any kind of reputation is painfully aware of those issues, and they will make sure that they are that they will stick to their contracts, to their promises to you, because they know that If they don't, they are screwed. If it becomes apparent that the data has been used beyond what they had promised it to be used, they're out of business essentially. So I think that, and I think what's happening is that our clients will understand that more and more as well. Now, there are some clients. So, for instance, if you work for some government agencies, or if you work for other clients who are highly conscious of security and confidentiality, they might just outright forbid you to use any kind of cloud-based tool. Well, if that's the case, then you won't be using cloud-based tools. I mean but if you don't have that kind of clause in any kind of agreement with your clients, I think there is no problem in using cloud-based tools.
Thank you, Jost. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, Jost.
Hi.
How did you have an experience with training machine translation engines to work with your freelance work in your daily freelance work? Did you have any successful or maybe failure with them?
So if I understood the question right, is whether I have any experience to train machine translation for my daily freelance work.
Yeah, or maybe like experimental.
Well, the quick answer is I don't, but I do have some thoughts about it. And the thoughts are that that I think it's for a freelance translator to build up a machine translation engine that will help you in your daily work. There have to be a number of conditions, one of which is that you work in a very, very, very narrow field, and that you have been able to assemble data, legally of course, within that legal field, narrow field, and have done that to a degree that it actually makes sense, that you have enough data to train machine translation engines. I think that the typical translator will find out that he or she doesn't have that kind of data. It's just really unlikely that you are able to build up translation memories in a narrow. Now we all have data, right? We've all been able to assemble lots of data over the years, but just like you, most likely, or just like many of you who are translators, that data covers a large range of subjects. Yes, we all specialized in some way, but even those of us who are specialized still cover a lot of areas within that specialization. And that data is not necessarily, I think, useful to train machine translation engines. So I think that I know there are a couple of products out there that offer the possibility of training machine translation engines for translators, but I don't feel particularly enthused about them. I think that ironically not ironically, but we are actually able as translators to be able to benefit from some of the generic machine translation engines quite well. Not in the traditional way of post-editing Google Translate or Microsoft Translator, but by being able to get more get smaller fragments out of the suggestions than the whole segment, and I think that that is not a bad way of using machine translation for translators as they translate. Again, not as a post-editing way of dealing with machine translation, but as an aid to your own translation.
Thank you for answering. Another question?
Hi, Jost. This is Sergey Yuriev from Ilangle, and thank you for a very interesting presentation. And only one statement a little bit confused me when you say that translators start to use machine translation more often. And from my experience, actually, our professional translators hate machine translation. So can you provide a little more data about this statement? Thank you.
So if I understood you right, you said that even though I said that that translators are using machine translation more often, your experience is that translators really hate machine translation. Is that right?
Yes, and I'm wondering about the data. How you find about this? What is the statistic? Yeah, what is the source of this
Okay,
information?
great. Thank you. So, for one thing, when we talk about machine translation, one thing we have to be really careful of, and I was not careful of that in my presentation, I'm aware, is that machine translation cannot be talked about in a vacuum. Machine translation should always be talked about in specific language combinations, for instance, right? I'm German. I'm a German translator, and German is just about as bad when it comes to machine translation as Russian is. So and much worse than, say, English to Spanish, English to Portuguese, English to Swedish, which are combinations that are more likely to be successfully used with machine translation. Russian, Ukrainian, German, not good usually when it comes to machine translation, right? What I see is that machine translation, there is a real change of course when it comes to machine translation. And that is that translators are starting to find out, even in languages like Russian and German and others that are not typically well suited for machine translation, that small partial segments within larger segments that machine translation suggests can have some real value in driving productivity for the translator. So imagine, for instance, you have a tool that has not only one machine translation engine connected to your processes, but you have 3 or 4 machine translation engines connected, right? You start to type, and as you type, the machine translation engines are queried whether they have a match to what you have already typed, and will display those matches of what you have already typed to you as you translate, and you can just accept those matches. And again, those matches will not be whole sentences, but little chunks of sentences, right? And that's one of those areas, I think, where translators are starting to use machine translation quite heavily. And and those things are supported by tools like Trados and Déjà Vu, etc. If you look at what the downloads of plugins for Trados, for instance, the downloads of those little machine translation plugins that allow you to do something like that are very, very high, for instance. That's one number I have. Or do me a favor and look at Lilt in the next few days or week or whatever, make sure that you spend some actual time with it. Don't just kind of glance at it and go like, oh, I understand, but really try to work with it for half an hour and see what you think about that kind of machine translation. It's a whole different concept of machine translation, and I think that we will see some of that more and more. So to come back to your question, I don't have actual good numbers, but I know that as a translator myself, that the use of machine translation in those more creative ways can be very, very helpful for my translation work, depending on my language combination, depending on the subject matter, etc., etc. But I think for so long, translators hate machine translation because A, they feel threatened by it, and B, because they've maybe have done some post-editing and don't like post-editing. And I get that. I hate post-editing. I've done post-editing as well, and I really don't like it very much. But if I can find ways to use machine translation in a way that where I can drive the translation rather than the machine translation engine driving me, which is post-editing, then I can really welcome it and I can become more productive. And I think that more and more translators are seeing that right now. And we see that really happening, I think, in the translation community. Hope that helps.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you very much for answering. So we are out of time, and we are waiting for the dinner. I guess all other people are pretty hungry. So
What about me? I want some dinner.
please come. So Jost, thank you very much again for your presentation, for your participation at UTIC. So we wish you all the best and see you in Ukraine one more time, probably in the future.
Sounds good.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.